Long before great kingdoms rose and fell, there stood a city that seemed impossible to conquer. Its name was Jericho. From a distance, the city looked like a fortress carved from the earth itself. Towering stone walls surrounded it, walls so thick that soldiers could patrol across the top. Watchtowers rose high above the desert, and massive gates sealed the city from any threat outside. To the people inside Jericho, those walls meant safety, protection, power. No army had ever broken through them. Travelers spoke of Jericho with awe. Merchants whispered that the city's defenses were unbeatable. Warriors said that attacking Jericho would be like trying to break a mountain with bare hands. And now, another army had arrived at its gates. Across the dusty plains stood the people of Israel, led by a man named Joshua. Behind him were thousands of men, women, and children, people who had wandered through the wilderness for 40 long years. They had crossed deserts. They had survived battles. And now they stood at the edge of the land God had promised them. But there was one problem. Jericho stood directly in their path. Joshua looked up at the towering walls and knew the truth. His people had courage, but they did not have siege weapons. They had faith, but they did not have ladders tall enough to scale the fortress. Against a city like Jericho, even the bravest army could fail. Then something happened that no one expected. God spoke to Joshua, but the plan he gave was unlike any battle strategy ever known. There would be no ladders, no catapults, no attack. Instead, God told Joshua something strange, something that must have sounded almost unbelievable. March around the city. Not once, but for 7 days. And say nothing. Joshua stood there in silence, staring at the walls of Jericho. The command made no sense. No army in history had ever conquered a city by walking around it. But Joshua had learned something during his years beside Moses. When God speaks, obedience matters more than understanding. And soon, the people of Jericho would witness a miracle no one would ever forget. Because the strongest walls in the land were about to fall. Long before great kingdoms rose and fell, there stood a city that seemed impossible to conquer. Its name was Jericho. From a distance, the city looked like a fortress carved from the earth itself. Towering stone walls surrounded it, walls so thick that soldiers could patrol across the top. Watchtowers rose high above the desert, and massive gates sealed the city from any threat outside. To the people inside Jericho, those walls meant safety, protection, power. No army had ever broken through them. Travelers spoke of Jericho with awe. Merchants whispered that the city's defenses were unbeatable. Warriors said that attacking Jericho would be like trying to break a mountain with bare hands. And now, another army had arrived at its gates. Across the dusty plains stood the people of Israel, led by a man named Joshua. Behind him were thousands of men, women, and children, people who had wandered through the wilderness for 40 long years. They had crossed deserts. They had survived battles. And now they stood at the edge of the land God had promised them. But there was one problem. Jericho stood directly in their path. Joshua looked up at the towering walls and knew the truth. His people had courage, but they did not have siege weapons. They had faith, but they did not have ladders tall enough to scale the fortress. Against a city like Jericho, even the bravest army could fail. Then something happened that no one expected. God spoke to Joshua, but the plan he gave was unlike any battle strategy ever known. There would be no ladders, no catapults, no attack. Instead, God told Joshua something strange, something that must have sounded almost unbelievable. March around the city. Not once, but for 7 days. And say nothing. Joshua stood there in silence, staring at the walls of Jericho. The command made no sense. No army in history had ever conquered a city by walking around it. But Joshua had learned something during his years beside Moses. When God speaks, obedience matters more than understanding. And soon, the people of Jericho would witness a miracle no one would ever forget. Because the strongest walls in the land were about to fall. The city of Jericho had stood for generations, watching over the fertile valley near the Jordan River. Long before the people of Israel ever arrived, Jericho had already become one of the strongest fortified cities in the region. Its walls were legendary. They were not simple barriers of stone. Jericho's defenses were built in layers, massive outer walls and towering inner walls rising above them. From a distance, the city looked like a giant fortress growing out of the earth itself. Soldiers could patrol along the top of the walls, scanning the plains for enemies. Guards stood watch from tall towers, ready to sound the alarm if danger approached. And now, danger had arrived. Word had already spread through the streets of Jericho that a massive group of travelers had entered the land. They were not ordinary travelers. They were the people of Israel, the same nation that had escaped Egypt years earlier under the leadership of Moses. Stories about them had traveled far. People whispered about how their God had parted the sea, how armies had been defeated in the wilderness, how strange miracles seemed to follow them wherever they went. Those stories made the leaders of Jericho uneasy. But the city still had one great advantage: its walls. Inside Jericho, the rulers believed that no wandering nation could possibly break through their defenses. Their gates were sealed tightly. Their soldiers were armed and ready. Archers stood along the walls with bows drawn, watching the Israelite camp in the distance. From the top of the towers, the guards could see thousands of tents spread across the plain. The Israelites had arrived, and they were waiting. Meanwhile, outside the city, Joshua stood quietly among his people. The desert wind moved softly across the land as he studied the fortress before him. He had seen many challenges in his life. He had crossed the wilderness with the Israelites for 40 years. He had fought enemies and watched God provide for his people again and again. Yet the sight of Jericho's towering walls was enough to make even the bravest warrior pause. This was no ordinary city. If the Israelites attempted to attack directly, the defenders could easily rain arrows and stones down upon them from above. Without siege weapons or tall ladders, the walls would be nearly impossible to scale. Any normal army would have turned away. But Joshua remembered the words God had spoken to him. The plan was not to attack. The plan was to march. Soon Joshua gathered the leaders of Israel and began explaining what would happen next. As he spoke, some of the men looked confused. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The strategy sounded strange, almost too simple. But Joshua's voice remained calm. God had given the command, and the people of Israel had learned something during their long journey through the wilderness. When God gives instructions, obedience is more important than understanding. So preparations began. 7 priests were chosen to carry sacred trumpets. The priests would walk before the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence among his people. Behind them, the army of Israel would march. Not to attack, not to shout, but to walk in silence around the mighty city of Jericho. And high above them, the soldiers on the walls watched with curiosity. They had no idea what was about to happen. Night had fallen over the plains outside Jericho, but sleep did not come easily to many in the camp of Israel. Fires flickered between the rows of tents as soldiers sat quietly, whispering among themselves. Some sharpened their weapons out of habit, though they had been told they would not need them tomorrow. Others stared toward the distant silhouette of the city walls rising against the dark sky. The fortress looked even more intimidating at night. Its towers stood like shadows against the stars, and torchlights burned along the top of the walls where Jericho's guards continued their watch. From time to time, the distant echo of footsteps drifted down as soldiers patrolled the ramparts. Inside the city, the people of Jericho were also restless. News had spread quickly that the Israelites had arrived. Doors were barred. Gates were reinforced. Soldiers prepared for battle, expecting ladders, siege towers, or an attack at dawn. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, Joshua rose and called the leaders of Israel together. The camp slowly came to life as people stepped outside their tents and gathered to hear his instructions. Joshua spoke calmly, repeating the command that God had given him. The plan was simple. Each day, the people of Israel would march around the city once. 7 priests would walk at the front, each carrying a trumpet made from a ram's horn. Behind them would come the Ark of the Covenant, carried by priests. Soldiers would march ahead and behind it, forming a silent procession that would circle the city. But there was one rule that seemed almost impossible. No one was allowed to speak. Not a shout, not a chant, not even a whisper. The only sound that would be heard was the blowing of the trumpets. When Joshua finished explaining the command, the crowd remained quiet for a moment. Some of the soldiers looked puzzled. Others frowned, as if trying to understand the purpose behind such an unusual strategy. March around the city? Without attacking? Without speaking? To many warriors, the idea sounded strange, almost foolish. In every battle they had ever heard of, victory came through strength, speed, or clever tactics. But this plan seemed to rely on something entirely different. Faith. Joshua knew what some of the men were thinking, but he also knew something they had learned again and again during their years in the wilderness. God did not fight battles the way humans expected. When the people of Israel had escaped Egypt years earlier, it was not their swords that saved them. It was God who had parted the sea before them under the leadership of Moses. And now God was about to do something extraordinary again. Soon the priests stepped forward, holding their ram's horn trumpets. Others carefully lifted the Ark of the Covenant onto their shoulders. The soldiers formed ranks, standing ready. The march was about to begin. Far above them, the guards on the walls of Jericho leaned forward, watching with curiosity. They expected to see an army preparing for battle. Instead, they saw something strange. The Israelites began walking. Slowly, quietly, step by step, the procession moved toward the city walls. The priests blew their trumpets as the people marched, and the sound echoed across the valley. Yet aside from those trumpets, the entire army remained silent. No shouting, no threats, no attack, just footsteps and the haunting sound of horns. The soldiers of Jericho looked at one another in confusion. What kind of army marched around a city without fighting? What were the Israelites doing? They did not know it yet. But this was only the first day, and the strangest part of the plan had not even begun. As the first day of marching came to an end, the people of Israel quietly returned to their camp outside Jericho. There had been no battle. No arrows had been fired. No walls had been attacked. They had simply walked around the city once, and then gone back to their tents. From the top of Jericho's walls, the soldiers watched them leave with puzzled expressions. The strange procession had circled the entire city in silence, except for the sound of the trumpets carried by the priests. To the defenders of Jericho, the whole scene looked ridiculous. Some laughed. Others mocked the Israelites as they returned to their camp. If this is their attack, one soldier joked to another, we have nothing to fear. Inside the city, the leaders of Jericho tried to make sense of what they had seen. They had prepared for siege engines and ladders, for soldiers charging the gates or trying to scale the walls. But marching silently around the city? That made no sense at all. Meanwhile, in the camp of Israel, the people waited for the next morning. And when dawn arrived, something surprising happened. The procession formed again. The priests stepped forward with their ram's horn trumpets. Behind them, the Ark of the Covenant was lifted onto the shoulders of the priests. Soldiers gathered into ranks ahead of it and behind it, forming the same silent line as before. Then Joshua gave the signal. The march began again. Once more, the people walked around the city in complete silence while the priests blew their trumpets. Around the walls they went, past the great gates, past the watchtowers where Jericho's guards stared down at them in disbelief. When the circle was complete, the Israelites returned to their camp exactly as they had done the day before. Still no attack. Still no battle. Only silence. Inside Jericho, confusion began turning into amusement. By the third day, the soldiers on the walls were openly mocking the strange army below them. Some shouted insults down at the Israelites as they passed by. Others leaned over the walls, laughing at the sight of thousands of people simply walking around the city without doing anything. The defenders believed the Israelites were weak. Afraid. Perhaps they thought the army was trying to frighten them with some strange ritual. But the people of Jericho had complete confidence in their walls. They were certain the city could never fall. Day 4 passed. The march continued exactly as before. The priests blew their trumpets. The soldiers walked in silence. The city walls stood tall and unmoved. By the 5th day, the routine had become almost ordinary. Each morning the Israelites marched around Jericho once and then returned to camp. Each evening the guards on the walls reported the same thing to their leaders. No attack. No siege. Just marching. But something important was happening during those quiet days. With every step around the city, the people of Israel were learning something deeper about faith. They did not fully understand why God had given these instructions. The plan still seemed unusual, even mysterious. Yet they kept obeying. They marched. They remained silent. They trusted. Finally, the 6th day arrived. Once again the procession formed outside the camp. Once again the army marched around the mighty walls of Jericho. And once again the city remained untouched. But as the Israelites returned to their camp that evening, many of them felt a sense of anticipation growing inside their hearts. Because everyone knew what was coming next. The 7th day? And according to the command God had given Joshua, the seventh day would be different. Very different. Before the sun had fully risen over the valley, the camp of Israel was already awake. A quiet sense of anticipation moved through the people as they prepared for the final day. For 6 days they had followed the command faithfully, marching once around Jericho and returning to camp in silence. The walls of the city had remained strong and unmoved, and the soldiers of Jericho had grown increasingly confident. But today was the seventh day, and this day would not be the same. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Joshua gathered the leaders of Israel once more. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "Today," he said, "we will march around the city 7 times. 7 times. The people listened carefully as Joshua explained the final part of God's command. The priests would continue blowing their trumpets as they marched, just as they had done during the previous 6 days. The Ark of the Covenant would remain in the center of the procession, carried by the priests. But after the 7th march around the city, something new would happen. Joshua would give the signal, and when he did, the people would shout. Not a quiet cheer, not a simple cry, a powerful shout with all their strength. The people nodded, understanding that the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Soon the procession formed once again. 7 priests stepped forward, each holding a ram's horn trumpet. Behind them, the Ark of the Covenant was lifted carefully onto the shoulders of the priests who carried it. Soldiers formed ranks in front and behind, creating a long, silent line stretching across the plain. Joshua raised his hand. The march began. Slowly, the Israelites moved toward the city walls as the priests blew their trumpets. The sound echoed through the valley as thousands of footsteps followed the familiar path around Jericho. High above them, the guards on the walls watched with curiosity. They had seen this before. For 6 days the Israelites had done the same strange march. The soldiers expected the procession to circle the city once and then leave again. But today something was different. After completing the first circle, the Israelites did not stop. They kept marching. Around the city, they went a second time, then a third. From the top of the walls, the soldiers of Jericho began to look at one another uneasily. The pattern had changed. The strange army was not leaving after the first march. Instead, the silent procession continued circling the city again and again. 4th time, 5th time. The sound of the trumpets echoed through the air, growing more intense with each lap around the fortress. Inside Jericho, people began gathering in the streets, looking up at the walls and wondering what was happening outside. Some felt nervous for the first time since the Israelites had arrived. The 6th march ended, but the Israelites continued walking. Now the tension in the air was almost unbearable. As the army began the 7th circle around Jericho, every person in the procession knew that the moment of decision had come. The priests lifted their trumpets and blew with greater strength. The soldiers marched forward with determined steps, and Joshua watched carefully, waiting for the exact moment God had promised. The 7th circle was nearly complete. Soon, Joshua would give the command. And when he did, the silence that had lasted for 7 days would finally be broken. The 7th march around Jericho was almost complete. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Dust rose beneath the feet of thousands of marching soldiers as the people of Israel followed the priests one final time around the great city walls. Above them, the guards of Jericho watched nervously. This was no longer amusing. For 6 days they had laughed at the strange army outside their city. They had mocked the silent march and trusted completely in the strength of their walls. But something about this 7th day felt different. The Israelites were still marching, and the sound of the trumpets was growing louder. At the front of the procession, the priests continued blowing their rams' horns with all their strength. The deep, echoing sound rolled across the valley again and again. Behind them, the Ark of the Covenant moved steadily forward, carried by the priests who walked carefully with each step. Then the moment arrived. The 7th circle was finished. For the first time in 7 days, Joshua lifted his voice. "Shout," he commanded the people, "for the Lord has given you the city." For a brief second, everything was still. The priests lifted their trumpets one more time and blew a long, powerful blast that echoed through the valley. And then, the silence broke. Thousands of voices erupted at once. Men, women, and soldiers shouted with all their strength. Their voices rose like thunder, echoing across the plains and crashing against the massive walls of Jericho. The sound was overwhelming. And then something incredible happened. The ground began to tremble. At first it was only a faint vibration beneath their feet, but within seconds the shaking grew stronger. The massive stones of Jericho's walls began to rattle as dust poured from the cracks between them. The soldiers standing on the walls looked around in shock. They felt the fortress moving beneath them. Large stones shifted. Bricks loosened. Cracks spread across the mighty walls that had protected the city for generations. Then, with a deafening roar, the impossible happened. The walls of Jericho collapsed. Stone after stone crashed to the ground as enormous sections of the fortress crumbled. Towers that had once stood tall above the valley shattered and fell. Dust exploded into the air as the great defensive walls broke apart before the eyes of everyone watching. The soldiers of Jericho were thrown into chaos. Their strongest defense was gone. Where towering walls had stood only moments earlier, now there were broken stones and open pathways leading directly into the city. The people of Israel stared in amazement for only a moment. Then Joshua gave the command to move forward. The army surged ahead. Through the fallen walls they ran, entering the city that had once seemed impossible to conquer. What no army in history had been able to do by strength or weapons had just happened in a single moment. Because the battle had never belonged to the people of Israel. It belonged to God. For a brief moment after the walls collapsed, the entire valley was filled with dust. The massive stones that once formed the fortress of Jericho lay scattered across the ground like broken mountains. Towers that had stood proudly for generations were now shattered ruins. The great gates that once sealed the city were buried beneath piles of fallen rock. The impossible had happened. The strongest city in the land was suddenly open. Through the gaps in the fallen walls, the army of Israel began to move forward. At the front stood Joshua, watching as his soldiers rushed toward the city. Just moments earlier, Jericho had seemed untouchable. Now its defenses were gone, and the people inside were thrown into confusion and panic. The soldiers of Jericho had prepared for a siege. They had expected ladders against the walls. They had expected arrows flying through the air. They had expected a long battle. But they had never imagined their walls would simply collapse. Without their fortress, the defenders had no protection. The Israelites entered the city through the fallen stones, spreading through the streets as the sound of battle echoed across the ruins. Dust filled the air, and the once proud city that had stood unchallenged for centuries was now overwhelmed. Yet in the middle of the chaos, Joshua remembered another command God had given. There was one place in Jericho that must be protected. Long before this day arrived, a woman named Rahab had shown kindness to the people of Israel. She had hidden 2 spies who came secretly into the city and had protected them from the king's soldiers. Because of her courage and faith, the spies had made her a promise. When the city fell, Rahab and her family would be spared. So Joshua called 2 men from among the soldiers, the same men who had once entered Jericho as spies. "Go to Rahab's house," he told them. "Bring her out, along with her family, just as you promised." The men hurried through the streets of the city until they found the house built along the wall. Miraculously, while so much of Jericho had collapsed, that small part of the wall still stood. Inside, Rahab and her family were waiting. They had placed the scarlet cord in the window exactly as the spies had instructed. When the soldiers of Israel saw the cord, they knew they had found the right place. Quickly they led Rahab, her parents, and her relatives out of the city to safety beyond the camp of Israel. Meanwhile, the battle continued throughout Jericho. What had once been the most secure city in the region was now defeated. Its walls were gone. Its pride was broken. The fortress that had seemed impossible to conquer had fallen in a single moment through the power of God. And as the dust slowly settled over the ruins of Jericho, one truth became clear to everyone who witnessed it. The victory that day had not come from weapons. It had come from faith.